Yeah, hello. Good evening, everyone. It's 6:05. This is a good moment to make a start with our first seminar of the autumn semester 2025 seminar series. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the 5 co-directors of the Independent Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, CSSGJ in short. Very pleased to open up this session. I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Anne Engelhardt from the University of Göttingen in Germany. Before we start, let me just give a couple of comments by way of introduction. Anne Engelhardt has got a PhD from the Kassel University in Germany and is now a lecturer in social sciences at the University in Göttingen. You've got a number of publications, but perhaps the one publication which we should mention is your book. I'm just trying to organize my screen here to make it possible. So yeah, it's called Logistical Choke Points, Precarious Work and Social Reproduction, Labor Conflicts and the Metabolic Rift in Ports and Airports in Brazil and Portugal, and it's published by the Verlag Barbara Budrich. And Anne, please correct me if I'm wrong, but actually the PDF is accessible free of charge. Is that correct on the website?
Yes, that's correct. I will also say
Fantastic.
something
So
about
in a moment, I will drop the link into the chat, and so those who are interested can get it, and it's published in English, so it's also widely acceptable. So that's fantastic. So congratulations to you, of course, for publishing the book. Now, tonight's talk is based on the book, yeah, and it's called, and I give you the full title, Social Reproduction Metabolism, the Laboring Body and Worker Struggles for Time and Space at Choke Points in Brazil and Portugal. Now, we are going to proceed in the usual manner. Anne is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and that then leaves us with another 40 minutes or so for questions, answers, comments, general debate. Anne, the floor is yours. Over to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for this warm welcome, and thank you, Andreas, also for this invitation to this, I think, really important lecture series. And especially right now, in times where we see a lot of rollback in terms of right-wing policies right now. So I will now share my screen, and it works very well because it just vanishes. The presentation, because maybe it works when I put it like this. Actually, it should work like that. 1 second. Yeah, today the technique doesn't want to follow me. And this, no, there. Okay, now we are there where I wanted us to be. I hope you can see the screen now. Thank you very much also for the invitation to speak at this very important lecture. As I said, or as Andreas already said, my name is Anne Engelhardt, and the talk that I'm giving here today, and I'm really happy to have the time for 40 minutes because I think I had never had the time to speak 40 minutes about my favorite topic. It is on social reproduction metabolism, and it's based, as Andrea said, on the book Logistical Choke Points, Precarious Work and Social Reproduction. And also, when you click on the link, you can, as Andrea said, get the copy open access. And I'm really happy that it has worked open access, because I think this is also a very important movement to get our knowledge as far and wide as possible into the world, and also as accessible as possible. So you can read it, and I'm really happy for every critical, uncritical, and friendly comment on the book. So far, I want to share with you what I want to present on today. First of all, I want to speak with you about the research topic and the questions. the overall topic I actually wanted or the way I wanted to call my book was actually Social Reproduction Metabolism, but unfortunately the publisher didn't think it was sexy enough, so it changed it a little bit. But I still think this is actually what it is all about. But the topic or the ground it is tackling, because the social reproduction metabolism is more a holism or holistic concept, but the topic it is tackling is logistics and choke points. And so I will start with this first, and then I will go into the topic of social reproduction metabolism, then explain why I also think that the state plays an important role in this. And then I will briefly speak about results and further ideas, what I'm planning to do in my future with this. So as I said, I would like to start with the point of logistics, because this is where I actually started the whole idea, where I came then up with this concept of social reproduction metabolism. In 2015, when I started, like 10 years ago, with this research project, there was a relatively interesting debate, larger debate coming up on the topic of choke points, or so-called ports and airports. And today we also discuss more on something like the Suez Canal, the Black Sea, and so on, as areas where which could be interesting for labor struggles, or which have a large potential to build up to rebuild the workers' movement. And interestingly, Edna Bonicic developed the idea of potential choke points in the same time when Beverly Silver published her famous book, Forces of Labor, actually in a period where class struggles generally were seen as on a historic low, where trade unions were considered on a historic low globally. And Edna Bonicic was, I would say, complementing a little bit the idea that that capitalism is basically moving around in the globe with certain spatial fixes. And Bonicic was explaining more what these spatial fixes actually are, and that these are places where capitalism can't move away, because there the commodity capital has to come back and has to be sold, especially in the global north. And this was actually an interesting discussion, that choke points therefore become even more important than they have been before the deindustrialization or the stronger globalization in the north. And also there were several ideas of logistics as action and research field for labor struggles coming up, the renewal of labor movements in that, and so on. And the second strand of this debate was that choke points were rather seen as spaces of hyper-surveillance, and especially Deborah Cohen, she published her book which was called The Deadly Life of Logistics, where she rather spoke about how important it is for transnational companies, for capital, if you like, or for capitalists to secure a seamless supply of commodities. And therefore, they need to make sure that there's exclusive access for workers to these places, and that there are increasing controls. And there's also, as Alke Jens, for instance, was writing with Benjamin Schütze together, her research on Buenaventura, a port where logistics is rather developing, and where a lot of violence and control is actually coming with this new development of the choke point. So between these two debates, as choke points as a magic bullet and choke points as spaces for hyper surveillance, I was starting to discuss with workers, and were studying explorative interviews, especially with workers in Portugal, with whom I had a long-standing debate link through the time of of the anti-austerity movement, where the dock workers then developed as a new important player. And they were rather speaking as choke points of choke points as spaces of precarity and danger for their own bodies. And I found this really interesting. So also in several discourses, for instance, of a colleague, Fatima Keros, she was rather highlighting the vulnerability of workers in these places, insecurity, unsafety of the own body, and also what I will go into detail even more with the concept of social reproduction metabolism, conflicts on time and space for social reproduction. So I had to reschedule a little bit my idea and how I want to tackle the whole topic with what workers were actually discussing. And when I asked them also about camera control and so on, they were rather saying, no, it doesn't play a role with us here. Maybe in other ports, maybe in other parts of the world, but in Brazil and Portugal, it didn't play such a large role. And maybe just to give an example of one quote, I won't give any more long quotes than this, but just one quote to show you what I mean when I say that this was more about vulnerability and precarity. It's just one quote. I will also read it. It says it was from a dock worker, interestingly, from Portugal, who himself became a hygiene and safety inspector himself. And a position that didn't exist before. So he had to make it up because in Portugal before that, there were no real safety controls or anything in the country. And Portugal also belongs to the countries in Europe with one of the highest mortality rates in labor in general. So he was saying, he went to one of the ports and then he was saying the spreader. The spreader is I have to go into some technical details. The spreader is is part of the crane that you can also see in the picture. And the spreader is something that spreads to the container and lifts up the container. And sometimes the height can be 20, 50 meters high. And then, for instance, transports the container from the ship to a lorry or to a train or something like that. Okay, this is the spreader. The spreader is not for transporting people. The spreader itself had, in this case, in a Portuguese port, a sticker that said that person transport was forbidden. So a stevedore didn't want to transport a crew member close to the ship on the spreader. There are things called safety cages. They are boxes with a container, but it's an open container prepared to transport people. So we saw workers on top of the ship, but we couldn't see a safety cage. So you could imagine if the container ship, if you ever have seen one, I think I've some here, but anyway, some models. If you have ever seen one, they are sometimes 20, 50 meters high. And when workers are on the ships, that means that they must have got up there with any procedure, and it must have been very dangerous actually, if there wasn't any safety procedure, and if they would have fallen down, then this would definitely meant severe damage. So we saw workers on the top of the ship. We couldn't see any safety cage. So we sent an expulsion to the company saying that the transportation of people is not correct. You have a sticker that says that you can't transport people. And what did they say? Let's take the sticker off. And this more or less shows you what it is to talk about hygiene and safety here. It's kind of getting around the situation. It's not doing things. It's not going through the best procedures. There's a sticker that says that you can't transport people, so you take the sticker off and you can. So the workers get on the spreader until any situation when there's a death. Maybe they will and then buy a safety cage. So obviously, this is a situation where a worker who trained himself through the support of the trade union to become a hygiene officer, and he sees such situation every day at the ports. He travels around, and this is the situation that you see actually. To just show you one of the examples, there are several ones like this, and workers always talked about this. So always when I asked them, okay, what about safety control, security, and so on, they were always like, oh, the last accident, this was what happened. And so because of this, I then identified three important, in my opinion, important research topics and questions. The first one is if workers and activists can exercise logistical power through choke points, ports and airports, why are there still precarious working conditions? And second, how does the restructuring of work at choke points through monitoring, regulations, laws, legislations, and directives affect the bodies of workers? And thirdly, how do trade unions and social movements address authoritarian practices and restrictions on the social reproduction of workers and develop strategies for re-obtaining decent jobs at choke points? I will now briefly say a little bit on logistics and why this is an important debate and why it's also something that should be developed further, also in terms of its critical and materialist underlining and theoretical understanding. Right now, I think you all have seen different struggles around the world that have used choke points as a political tool, you could say. So right now, with the different wars that have been going on, I have tracked this a little bit for the Russia-Ukrainian war, for instance, how workers were protesting at ports, were even making strikes at ports. There were 12 countries in 12 countries around the world where workers were refusing to deliver ammunition or arms to different sites, and in general we're saying we don't want to become a wheel inside the mobilization for war. And also right now with the Gaza, with the genocide in Gaza, we see that an increasing number of workers, especially also on choke points, but I would also say in different sectors, are going on strike, are protesting, and are using their critical positions in protest in what's happening right now. So we have a whole set of a whole body of studies right now on so-called critical logistics, who are concentrating on interruptions, irrationalities, and human beings and workers. And this is very new, and it's therefore critical because most of the studies that we know on logistics are actually rather on supply chain management, how a smooth transport should work, and so on. And everything that could be an interruption or irrationality is always like cut off from the discussion. So this is why the discourse on critical logistics is, especially for critical scholars, very important. A second is that they are looking at transport facilities and infrastructures. And but I would say what is important is to understand the materiality of these transport facilities and infrastructures. I had a discussion when I started my PhD that, well, if the capitalists want, they can just build a port wherever they want. You know, if they go on strike there, then they build a new port, or if they, and of course they have some flexibility, but I would say that you know, that especially the commodities themselves or the use value of the commodity is somehow structuring how infrastructure should look like and should function. For instance, if you look at transport of bananas or the transport of meat, so the infrastructure has to be specific with refrigeries. You have to have workers with the knowledge how these refrigerating containers are functioning, how they are transported, that they are not put next to a container with explosive material because this could be dangerous, and so on. So there's a lot of knowledge within the infrastructures that is linked actually to the use value of a commodity to make sure that this use value is actually still functioning or is still present, so that you at the end have a banana that you can eat and not something rotten or so, and else it's not exchangeable anymore. And this is why this is also, there's a large materiality how transport facilities and infrastructures are built. And this is something that I developed then. And also what I found really important that I worked out with Marx, The Capital, the second volume, and also Grundrisse and other works that he was using, where he was also already working on logistics, He was really excited, by the way, of the opening of the Suez Canal. He already lived there in this time. So what's important is that in every commodity, there is a change in location. So every commodity has to change the location. This is why there's always a grain of transport and movement in every commodity. And this is important because then what does that means then for choke points is that choke points are then a spatial and temporal permanent contradiction in capitalist logic and logistics. And choke points are an intermodal change in transport facilities. So as I said at the beginning with the spreader, for instance, you have to change, or ports are places where you change a container from a ship to a train or to a lorry and so on. And at the same time, this means that the commodity is slowing down. It has to slow down. It's impossible right now with the known techniques that we know to not slow it down with this intermodal transport. And most importantly, this is actually the case when we look at the Suez Canal or the Black Sea and so on. There is no alternative. So this we normally would say as social scientists, there are always alternatives. But in terms of transport, there is a certain material ground where you can't, you can't circumvent it. This is important. And what I also developed, and I haven't seen this before in any other book, is choke points are often linked to a colonial heritage. So especially when you look at infrastructures in the global south, in Brazil, but also in much, much more in certain African states, you can see that the infrastructures are very little developed, but you often have this hand, I would say. So you often have the situation that there is a that there is a port, for instance, here somewhere at the water, and then you have for instance, the railway to the field, to the campsite, or to the cotton field, or you have a railway to the maybe to the mining also, but you don't have an interconnection here. And this makes these roads very, very fragile, and there are little alternatives actually to them. And this makes choke points, especially in the global south, much, much more vulnerable to interruption than in other parts, for instance, in the global north, where you don't have such a type of infrastructure. Okay, now I come to the rather core of my talk, which is social reproduction and metabolism. Because what I found interesting, if we see that there is something like logistical power or, all this kind of possibilities, how exactly are workers using it? Why aren't they using it? What is the history on these places? How is this all actually developing and so on? And how is this also intersecting with different other power relations? So what I found interesting is to turn to social reproduction theory to look at workers. And I highly draw on Susan Ferguson, Titi Bhattacharya's work, and other colleagues who are on the materialist feminist side, who say that social reproduction does not create value, but it is actually the essential production of labor power as an intrinsic part of capital accumulation. And also reproduction is characterized of or low paid work. And also what I try to do in my work is to implement something systematically, the role of time and space, actually. How are these relations between social reproduction and production changing through different times and spaces, which I think has not been developed yet very systematically. And what I also found important, I mean, I look at dock workers who are quite masculinistic or at least framed as masculinist. I would say that social reproduction theory is not a women's topic, which is often framed like this, but it is a hermeneutics for more holistic analysis, or actually at all holistic analysis of the work and lives of all more or less wage-dependent people. And I think this is important because quite often we see a differentiation in the studies that we either look at social reproduction theory, and then we look at women or women in the whatever cotton industry or care industry or textile industry, or when we look at dock workers, for instance, we don't look at social reproduction at all. And I think what I also wanted to do is to bring us together empirically and theoretically, and also emphasize the importance that social reproduction is not just an add-on or an enlargement of the class analysis, but it is the class analysis, I think, to understand workers in their production, but also in their social reproduction field. So what did I do with this? I combined it with the term metabolism with ecological Marxism, if you like. And I try to see the metabolism between production and social reproduction. And in this, I say this in a minute, I see this on the body of the workers, as a scale where you see the tension between having to reproduce themselves and also having to produce commodities, and often not under their own will. And through this, I see a risk in the metabolic rift, because also what I think is important to understand is, of course, the body is part of nature itself. And so it can be also exposed to the metabolism and metabolic rift, such as Marx was analyzing for the metabolic rift between the countryside and the city, or different other spaces. It also can be seen here. So, and what I analyze here is that there is a tug of war between work and capital over the temporal and spatial aspects of social reproduction. And there are many, and already in Marx's works, there are many examples of this. For instance, about, the 8-hour working day is already a temporal struggle around the social reproduction metabolism. The places of work, housing is a struggle around this, free healthcare is a struggle around this, and so on. And I think I try to reconceptualize this a little bit more with feminist, more feminist and also ecological Marxism or Marxistic lens. And to make this more touchable, if you like, I use a Marxist feminist theorem of the working body. And I see the working body as a scale of the metabolic rift. So where you can see through chronic fatigue or fatal accidents, accidents in general, and so on, how the metabolic rift is having an impact, which means basically, or the metabolic rift basically means that a worker is not able to reproduce himself anymore and or to produce, to go to work or anything. Or to function in the way that capitalism wants it to function. And this is, of course, questionable, because, of course, a metabolic rift also means that you can't be there anymore for your family or for your friends, and so on. Then I would also say that the working body is especially self-willed and a resistant actor. So it's not just, a scale. It's not just something, a canvas where we can see processes on it, but it's also active itself. It's where we think with. It's the body. We have a body and we are a body. And with the body, we do, we think, we process. And what I like from Sarah, a colleague of mine, Sarah Coffey, she recently, she will publish it soon. She also wrote on the body, and she says that the body is also an archive of knowledge and resistance. So with this theoretical framework, I then operationalize this for the different power relations that we also see in capitalism in general. And I broke this down to the workplaces, because I think that we as human beings with our body are seen at different spaces in a different way, and also function at different spaces in different ways. And I thought that at ports and airports you can see gendered exploitation patterns. that are working with bodies in a specific way. So I developed this idea of exploitation patterns, and I use gendered exploitation patterns, racified exploitation patterns, and precarious exploitation patterns to explain further what is actually happening with the workers, but not just what is happening right now within them, but also to tell a whole story about transport and how our corporal beings, or how workers who have been working in transport, how their histories have been actually developing through the lens of gendered exploitation patterns, racified exploitation patterns, and precarious exploitation patterns. So I do a whole history, what this means actually for colonialism, for generally work labor division globally, and so on. So this sounds big, but there comes another layer to this, and then I will come to the results that I'm giving, but I still have a little bit of time, which is nice. So what is also coming into this, so here we are still on the basis of how the industry and general power relations are having an impact on the social reproduction metabolism, but the social reproduction metabolism is also works in certain governed areas. So it's not in thin air somewhere, but importantly, the state also plays a role in it. And I have a materialist definition of state and state apparatuses, which is classified or coming from Nikos Poulantzas. It's that states are a condensation of past social struggles, and they also right now pave the way for current struggles through laws, regulations, and infrastructures. And this is important because infrastructure is also what we see when we look at ports, when we look at airports and where they are built and how they are linked with other production areas and so on. But also it is a relational understanding of power, which manifests itself as effect of power asymmetries on actors in the social field. So importantly is I don't have a normative understanding or definition of power in this, but more that power can be exercised or not in a different way. And in terms of the social reproduction metabolism, the state regulates this metabolism and intervenes in this tug of war between capital and labor through labor laws. Labor laws are very important to shorten the time or the labor time. Labor courts, which were very important, especially in Brazil. Also the labor strike, the legal right to strike, labor inspection, personal industrial relations, and so on. So the state apparatuses are actors in temporal and spatial conflicts, as well as exercising the structures of the state. And interestingly, what I worked out in many examples was that when a choke point is blockaded and really blockaded over a longer period, this can be an expression or amplification of political crisis in a state. So, for instance, in 1973, before the Portuguese Revolution, there was a strike and a blockade of the airport in Lisbon, which ended with there were probably 2 fatalities. So, and the police tried to enter the airport and was attacked by workers. So it was kicked out. And we could see that 9 months later, there was the revolution developing, but the airport was also in this time the expression where, airplanes went to deliver medicine to the colonial or anti-colonial battle that Portugal was still in this time leading against Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique. It was an important place where workers were fighting for independent trade unions and trade union lists that they wanted to implement, which they won through this battle 9 months before the revolution. And also the picture that you can see here in the side is a blockade of the army that went into the Santos Dumont Airport in Rio de Janeiro in 1986, where it was just after the military dictatorship ended in Brazil, and the trade unions were actually, and this is also what I developed strongly in my work and in my book. They played actually a role in rebuilding the trade unions and tried to or were announcing a strike in the airport. And the airports in Brazil are really sensitive because of this colonial heritage of the infrastructure. And they immediately sent the military to stop this again, which was obviously going against the narrative that the military dictatorship has ended. So it was a very tense situation, and it showed that the Brazilian state at this very beginning, or the non-military Brazilian state, was already sliding into a political crisis again, and have several of such examples. Also before, for instance, before the beginning of the military dictatorship in Brazil. So what about the results and further ideas? And I'm happy to know that I have 8 minutes left for this, but I think it's important to take the time. Just drawing from the questions that I have listed at the beginning, if workers and activists can exercise logistical power through choke points, ports and airports, why are there still precarious working conditions? And one is this gendered exploitation patterns that I just presented. Especially in the ports, you could see something that I call masculinist exploitation patterns, which have a long history, and I trace this as well, where you have a high role of self-exploitation, the exposition of something like Uli Brinkmann calls this omnipotence postulate, or there's also the term protest masculinity, which leads into workers having self-harming actions, but also presenting themselves as stronger as they are, which also leads to a counter movement of other workers who say that this is even more dangerous for us because we have to work together as a gang, and none of us should endanger themselves because it can harm all of us. And another aspect that Jean Sim calls token fatigue also played a large role in the ports, especially in Santos in Brazil, where more and more female workers are entering the workforce, but they are explaining that especially at the beginning of their career, they are attacked as, or they are misclassified as, aren't you a prostitute, or shouldn't you go home and wash the dishes? And often also there were also stories of violence, physical violence as well. But also I had an interview with a transport worker in 2018 who later was very active in talking about the infrastructures at the ports and also transphobia. He unfortunately died 2 years ago. And for this, because he was so active, this also led the Port Authority to make a large exhibition on diversity in the port. So it was a very important development. But I think token fatigue, which means that workers who are in a minority in a certain setting also become very exhausted and very, having maybe also lower results in their work there. And this can, of course, in generally also split the workforce to fight for better working conditions for all. Another aspect is in airports, what I saw in terms of gendered exploitation patterns is that women are either sexualized or invisibilized. And what I looked at is at workers who were working at the passage, especially, so in check-in, or social assistants who worked with people with walking disabilities and so on, or passengers with working disabilities. And they were saying that they felt in no one's world, they felt either sexualized or they had no chance really to fight for a better situation because the trade unions didn't see them as part of them. And and they didn't see any career options. In terms of racified exploitation patterns, what I saw at the ports especially is a strong othering in terms of, or self-othering, in terms of we as the Portuguese people always do it wrong, or we always believe in something higher, but we should rather believe in our laws and so on. There was a lot of this kind of depressive or, you know, self-othering that the Portuguese can't make it better or something like this. But what I definitely saw in the history, I also try to develop in my book, is the racified labor regime of seafarers, and especially this kind of racification, and also you know, which often means for especially precarious work, can endanger port workers as well. So when seafarers are, for instance, forced to because of their low standards, to unlash containers, and in a situation where the ship hasn't berthed yet, this can lead to containers falling at the ports. It can affect port workers and so on. So they are very, but they, in my opinion, they are very sensitive to this question of racified labor regimes of seafarers, but it definitely has an impact for them. But I wouldn't say it is a splitting or separating argument, but rather something that they are trying to tackle in certain movements. And the airport, I would say, has a very strong racified exploitation pattern. We see front and back offices, front and back office segregation. And what I found extremely interesting is the whole story of the creation of the so-called white space. So that the cabin work is often very much characterized by so-called white workers. And this has a really long history, and interestingly also in Brazil. And I tackle the whole history, actually, how this happened and how actually the aviation industry developed this white space culture or racification, I would say, in competition, for instance, to other transport sectors. Then to the question, how does the restructuring of work at choke points through monitoring, regulations, laws, legislation, and so on affect the bodies of workers? There are temporal and spatial conflicts, for instance, at ports. What I found important to mention is that in Portugal, the chronic fatigue and accident rate is double as high as in the ports in Brazil, which has to do with temporal conflicts, which is linked to that port workers in Portugal have less temporal autonomy when to choose their shifts, and they see more overtime. So this had a large impact on their social reproduction metabolism. So it meant more accidents and more absenteeism of work. And in terms of space, there is more outdated technical facilities, missing maintenance, and safety restrictions. I won't go into everything because of time, but yeah, the airports, we see that there are more similarities in Portugal and Brazil in terms of overtime, compulsory work, compulsory part-time work, and no time for training, which was mentioned as a temporal conflict, and so on. But in general, I think that airports are very little research in terms of the labor regimes there. And this is definitely something that I want to go deeper into in my next studies. Yeah, so how do trade unions and social movements address authoritarian practices and restrictions? What I found really interesting is how they are really how trade unions are very self-active in this, how they established occupational health and safety structures via trade unions and independent international exchange of networks, how they, but also how the different infrastructures on which workers are working, how the spaces, if it's a colonial or post-colonial space or and infrastructure, or an infrastructure from the global north, has an impact on how they are organizing internationally. For instance, in Brazil, because of this huge infrastructures, my impression was that workers didn't necessarily feel a need to organize internationally. They did this for different reasons sometimes, but especially airport workers in the past decade or 2 decades were having very isolated struggle and used these potentials that they had only for improving their own working conditions and social reproduction metabolism, especially in terms of shifts and night shifts and so on, but not for the larger interest of the working class. So they didn't participate, for instance, in general strikes anymore. Yeah, and in Portugal it was definitely different. The topic of of qualitative demands on time and space were very important. For instance, in the aviation industry, in Ryanair strikes, and in also in the port sector. But here, interestingly, the trade unions always sought to solidarity with international other institutions to support their strikes. And I would say because Portugal is a very tiny country and infrastructurally for the aviation and the port industry, it's very easy to reshift its services to other ports and in whatever Italy or Spain, for instance. And if they went on solidarity strikes, then this had a larger international, but also larger impact for the choke points there. Just briefly on further ideas, I think there are a lot of social reproduction issues like the heat and extreme weather conditions and the impact on choke points, studies on the role of reproduction and temporal and spatial conflicts, and in climate change. And then also the body versus capital, temporal and spatial conflicts, using the example, what I found really important, of the crew change crisis in seafaring. I can't go into details, or also the new wave of airport strikes after the pandemic. Okay, so I really want to end here now, and thank you so much for your patience and your time. This is my references list, and if you want to know more about the methodology, I can later go into details on this as well. So
excellent.